Good morning. Welcome everybody to the Climate 100 webinar. This is our overview of California's $54 billion climate commitment. Be looking back and looking forward, the successes and what's to come. My name is David Weisskopf. I am Senior Policy Advisor for Climate at NextGen Policy, and I lead our Climate 100 project. NextGen Policy fights for progressive policy change to address environmental, social, racial, and economic inequities in California through justice-centered legislative advocacy, grassroots partnerships, and democratic civic engagement. A couple of housekeeping items as we get started here. There will be a chat window that a member of our team will be populating with various resources and links throughout the presentation. If you'd like to submit a question, there is a Q&A box. We'll be holding those until the end of the presentations. So we won't be peppering them throughout. And that is about it. With just a brief introduction, I'll just introduce the Climate 100 project and what we have been doing in order to help advance this California climate commitment. The goals of the Climate 100 project at NextGen Policy are twofold. In 2022, this year, we want to help raise as much money as we could to help tackle climate change through the state budget. In that effort, we worked with our friends in the administration, key legislators, environmental and environmental justice advocates from around the state. It was a huge success for everyone involved. This year's budget represents the largest investment in climate change in the history of California, more than any other state has done. When you compare it to the amount that the federal government has put forward in the Inflation Reduction Act, our $54 billion commitment is 2.7 times per capita per year, the level of investment in that federal program. It's a big deal, to say the least. We're very excited about it. But there's more to do. The second goal of Climate 100 is to align all of our state spending with our climate goals and the realities of the climate crisis. This year's budget really does go a long way towards integrating climate into more aspects of the state's budget and operations. But there's more work to be done, and there always is. And as we face more challenging economic circumstances in coming years, it'll be even more vital to treat accounting for climate as much a part of our approach to enacting fiscally responsible budgets across the board as any other consideration, such as revenue availability, interest rates, and the other things that we kind of bake into the day-to-day budgeting process. We need to make climate really as much a part of that as everything else. So that 54 billion represents a combined 20 billion for zero emission vehicles, charging infrastructure, rail transit, and other clean transportation. There's another 14 billion for water, wildlife, wildfire, and agriculture, 8 billion for resilient communities and adaptation, and a little over 9 for the electricity system, and particularly reliability within the electricity system. But those big numbers don't really tell the story of what this budget does for real people in real life. To talk about the successes and the real world benefits of the $54 billion climate commitment, the broader context for how this affects the state's economy, how we can keep up the momentum in coming years, we have really a star-studded panel of guests today. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Lauren Sanchez, Senior Climate Advisor to Governor Newsom, Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, Gustavo Velasquez, the Director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development, Shireen D'Souza, Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy and International Relationships at the California Environmental Protection Agency, David Hochschild, Chair of the California Energy Commission, and NextGen's founder and co-executive chair of Galvanize Climate Solutions, Tom Steyer. To kick us off, Secretary Crowfoot, Director Velasquez, and Deputy D'Souza, I'd like to start with you. And I'd love it if you could please discuss some of what you see as the most important and consequential new funding in this budget. Especially love to hear about programs that have a strong connection to the climate crisis, but that we might not ordinarily think of as climate programs. To the extent possible, I'd like you to treat this as a free-flowing conversation among each other, but I may hop in with a question or two, and otherwise I'll leave it to you to take it from here. Whoever is first out of the gate gets to go first.
I'm glad to start. Dave, thanks so much to you and NextGen, and really to climate advocates across the state. I think we're, all recognize the climate crisis we face and how it's manifesting like in our lives. But I think it's an important moment, as you started out, to reflect on the progress we've made. $54 billion for climate action, more funding than most every other country in the world spends to combat climate and protect people and nature from climate change. Incredible. And so huge thanks to you guys and so many others for driving this. Big thanks to the partnership of the legislature, the leadership of Lauren and the governor and the governor's office. It's incredible. Our agencies, let me speak for myself, my agency finds itself with more resources than we've ever had to tackle climate. And that's a big deal. I also want to just recognize that not only did we collectively pass this historic budget, but we have in tandem this legislative set of this legislative package, really probably the most aggressive action taken in over a decade on climate. Again, big thanks to advocates and the legislature, partnership with the governor. And that really sets some important new North Stars for us, including codifying carbon neutrality by 2045 and accelerating our transition to clean energy and zero emission vehicles. So all really, really big deal. I want to let Gustavo and Shireen get in, but I'll just tell you from where I sit, our agency focuses a lot on building climate resilience. And I think 10, 15 years ago, there was a real separation between cutting carbon pollution, which was climate mitigation, and then what we knew as climate adaptation. But we know now that the impacts of climate change are here: drought, wildfire, extreme heat, flooding, and sea level rise never too far off. And so now we have more funding than we've ever had to actually invest in the most vulnerable communities to all of those impacts. And increasingly, we're talking about not doing that separately from slashing carbon pollution and helping people transition, but really doing it together. So we have upwards of $1.5 billion, for example, for nature-based solutions, how we better restore and protect nature to actually help us combat climate change. So we can talk more about that.
Thanks, Wade, for starting us off. And thank you so much, Dave, for bringing us together. This is such a valuable conversation. And thank you so much to you and your team for everything you did to get the budget passed. I know it's incredible, it's historic, and it wouldn't have happened without the partnership of stakeholders like NextGen Policy and many others. Completely agree and want to amplify everything that Wade just said. To me, one of the things that's so incredible about this budget is the focus on reducing disparities and also advancing our equity agenda, simultaneous with driving down emissions and building resilience to in the face of the climate crisis. Let me highlight one area that I'm super excited about, and that's the zero emission vehicle package. $10 billion over 6 years. And I'm sure everyone's aware that the transportation sector is the biggest contributor to California's greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for like half of our emissions when you take into account also the upstream emissions. But it's also the sector choking our communities and creating some of the worst air quality in the country. So taking action through this zero emission vehicle budget kind of feeds two birds with one seed, right? It's really driving down emissions and cleaning our air at the same time. And a huge focus of that, remember I was saying, I was highlighting the equity and the focus on reducing disparities. And so a big portion of that $10 billion, like around $6 billion, is for the medium and heavy duty sectors. And we all know that, it's the low income communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by criteria pollutants, by air toxics associated with heavy duty transport. So like $2 billion for ZEV school buses and related charging infrastructure, almost $2 billion for clean trucks, buses, and off-road equipment, another $1 billion for drayage trucks and infrastructure, another almost $500 million for cleaning up other types of port-related emissions, and that's just on the medium and heavy-duty side. There's also over $2 billion, like $2.5 billion for the passenger vehicle side for programs like Clean Cars for All and CVRP that are really going to help, and related charging and fueling infrastructure that are really going to help ensure that low-income communities, disadvantaged communities are not left behind, that they're part of the ZEV transportation revolution.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Tom and NextGen for hosting this discussion today. The first thing I want to acknowledge is the fact that maybe some in the audience would see the state housing department as an outlier in this conversation. I promise you there is a lot in common here. Maybe the only way in which I'm the outlier is that all of these esteemed colleagues in the administration are extremely bright and talented. But other than that, we have just a lot in common. Housing is often not included as a central component in how we talk and act about climate change. And for that reason, I am really grateful that HCD has been invited to be a part of this conversation. The recent budget demonstrates very clearly that Governor Newsom and its administration understand how imperative housing, how we build housing, how where we build housing, for whom we subsidize housing, all of that is imperative to climate adaptation, mitigation, and the response to the effect of climate change. That these issues are really inextricably linked, and that we must do all we can to address homelessness, housing affordability, and climate change together. And I continue to find that these issues continue to be viewed many times as competing interests, despite their mirror context. Think about this, they're both defined by place. They both depend on intergovernmental coordination and collaboration across policy domains and stakeholders. They're both exacerbated by historical and ongoing disparities by race and income. The bottom line is that both affect human and economic opportunity, housing and climate. And the evidence speaks for itself that climate and the housing crisis disproportionately affect frontline communities, low-income communities. Think about in California, farm workers, for example. These are the Californians bearing the brunt of extreme heat, drought, poor air quality, and inadequate living conditions. I mean, think about the Central Valley, right? I always point that as a great example. Policy making that promotes infill housing reduces dependence on vehicles, and that matters because where we put housing promotes the use of public transportation, uses climate-friendly materials, and better safety standards must be embedded into our climate strategy, and vice versa. And that's exactly what we're doing here in California. This reduces greenhouse gas emissions while helping close our housing gap in California, which is huge. According to our department, 2.5 million new homes have to be built roughly in the next 8 years to stabilize the housing market, to stabilize the exorbitant cost of housing across the income spectrum. This is really, everybody is feeling the pain of the exorbitant cost of housing. So I'm encouraged, I think we all are, by this understanding, the understanding that is reflected in the governor's recent climate action, enacting some of the nation's most aggressive climate measures. And just a couple of examples. Governor Newsom's budget includes $425 million roughly over the next 2 years for HCD's infill infrastructure grant program, which prioritizes prime infill parcels in downtown-oriented areas and brownfields. Again, it's all about where we create these housing opportunities in a way that will reduce the effect of climate. Recognizing that there are infill development opportunities in more suburban and rural population centers. And sometimes it's a misconception that they aren't there, but they are there. Second example is adaptive reuse projects for conversion to affordable housing. The enacted budget has about $450 million over the next 2 years for adaptive reuse incentive programs that would remove the cost barriers for repurposing commercial and other unused or underused buildings as housing. And again, this is all about reducing costs, selecting the best places where we can build housing and really create the opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Some people don't understand or don't think that the residential housing market in the United States is the 6th emitter of harmful greenhouse gases in the world. And so we really need to connect these two issues, and we are definitely doing that here in the state of California.
So you've all mentioned both the scale of the investment and the scale of the challenges we face, right? 2.5 million new homes needed. We have to, I think, turn over probably 20 million private vehicles, entire heavy duty fleets, entire port fleets. Need to electrify transportation. Wildfire, I think everyone is aware of how big a problem it's become, but may not be aware, that in some cases, a single fire can emit as much carbon as a year's worth of any of these other sectors as well. How big a dent are we making with this budget? What's and what can we look forward to? Where do we see the scale of the impact of these investments?
I might take a crack first. You take, for example, wildfire and reducing catastrophic wildfire risk, Dave. You pointed that out. With the budget last year and this year, which is part of this overall 54 billion of climate, we are expanding our proactive upfront efforts to reduce catastrophic fire risk by almost 20 times. So you had a program that received about $75 to $200 million over the last few years each year. And that's scaling up to now almost $3 billion over 2 years. So I would say, we are kind of taking a quantum leap. And this is just one example. Gustavo and Shireen have their examples, like scaling up in a significant way, whether it's zero emission vehicles or to infill housing or renewable energy, et cetera. But that being said, I think we all recognize climate's also accelerating. So the way I talk about it is it's an important down payment. It's certainly not mission accomplished in terms of the funding that we have, but it's going to let us go further and faster than we've ever gone. And I think in the area of wildfire, for example, we're already seeing some of these proactive projects like fuel breaks actually pay off and keep small fires that are more natural in California small and not catastrophic and dangerous. I'll also point out that, we have historic funding from the federal government, the Biden-Harris administration, between the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So part of what we have to do in California is, yes, allocate the money, get it out there, particularly to vulnerable communities as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible, but then leverage the federal funding as well and ensure that we're actually utilizing that to move even further.
And I'll just add that the budget, the incentive dollars are huge. They're going to be, critical in transforming, sticking with the ZEV example, but we're also pairing it with the kinds of regulatory change that will really, really move the needle. So you have the incentive dollars, the $10 billion over 6 years for big and little ZEVs, but you also have advanced clean cars too, that just passed. And that will ensure that we meet the 2035 all sales of new passenger vehicles being zero emission. Many other states have it in their pipeline to adopt it. So you'll really see that shift, not only in California, but around the rest of the country, around the rest of the world. You have advanced clean fleets, which will drive down emissions in the medium and heavy duty sector. And that includes a 100% sales target for the vehicle manufacturers in 2040 as well. So it's really that pairing in a very kind of synced up way of the incentive dollars and the regulations to really make sure we're moving the needle.
And I'll just, piggyback on what the Deputy Secretary said. It is the scale of the investments, but it is really how we are coordinating so that these investments fit very well with each other. We have something very wonky in the housing area called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, roughly estimated every 8 years. It estimates how much more housing we need to build based on population growth and, shifts in the housing market. And because we've been anticipating the next cycle of this RHNA number, anticipating pouring millions of dollars into regions and localities to plan, but to plan according to what? Well, to plan according to infill development, housing for all incomes, reduction of vehicle mile travels, affirmatively furthering fair housing in ways that lead to transformative outcomes and accelerate the implementation of regional and local plans to achieve climate-friendly goals.
So maybe with just a minute or two left in this discussion, how can your agencies and departments work best together to get these syntheses? I think that one thing I heard all of you mention was schools. And so maybe is there something there where there's significant overlap that any of you would like to highlight?
Well, Dave, I'll say one area where we're already working together is make these programs more accessible to communities in California. I think historically, state programs are pretty complicated and pretty opaque for communities to understand. And as Shireen pointed out, a disproportionate amount of this funding is going to underserved communities and essentially environmentally overburdened communities. And so what we're trying to do is make our programs more accessible. One area is through pilots to provide advances in funding and not requiring reimbursements for smaller local governments or community-based organizations. But then also to really help mix and match programs. So one community can actually take advantage of several pots of funding. So I think that's one area of interagency work. And I would just say, as NextGen and other advocacy organizations, just keeping us accountable for actually ensuring that the funding that you all have helped secure is actually finding its way into communities that need it. And so we can partner with you and of course each other on ensuring that these programs are actually going where they're needed.
And, Dave, one of the things that is so incredible about this budget is it really mainstreams, and you mentioned this at the top, it mainstreams climate across all of our agencies, across every single sector. And it really takes the next step in integrating mitigation and adaptation. They're no longer, we can't be treating these as siloed issues. So there are multiple fora, interagency working groups where, whether climate as housing or related to nature-based solutions, that are really trying to sync up all of these agendas and move them forward in ways that ensure that we're not leaving anything on the table. We're taking everything into account.
And I'll just mention quickly, echoing what the secretary said. It's a lot of education, right? We're dealing with many stakeholders, builders and developers and jurisdictions, that when we talk about decarbonization of the residential market, or when we're talking about moving very aggressively on the electrification of parking, for example, because we have to pair our goals with other goals that are happening on the climate agenda. There's a lot of education needs to happen to understand, yes, we can take an incremental approach, but we have to at some point get there to a carbon neutral residential market. And that, a lot of the stakeholders are worry about us. It's just to us, at least in the housing area, it's just a lot of education to people that typically don't fully understand what are the other types of goals. They think a lot about, it's all about cost and cost, obviously cost can come at a greater cost. And so we just a lot of education that what needs to happen. And it's very helpful to bring the administration together and work on that education piece really across a broad range of the stakeholders, because some of them understand it quite well. Others, may take some more time.
Great. Thank you all for these thoughtful answers and for the discussion of what we have so far in the budget. We will come back and rejoin you at the question and answer period in just a few minutes. But I want to pivot to hear from Lauren Sanchez, Tom Steyer, and David Hochschild. We have a huge, terrific new budget approved in this year, but I think it is no secret economic conditions are worsening globally. We're unlikely to see a big surplus like we had this year anytime soon. How do we keep up momentum? How do we accelerate climate action and climate investment in California? Where can we mobilize parts of the budget that can do double duty or triple duty on climate, that are waiting and ready to be mobilized, but not quite there yet? Maybe I'll leave it there and let you all take it away.
Awesome. Happy to, Dave. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having this discussion. Nice to see you, Tom. I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to thank both Tom and Dave and the entire organization for not only hosting us today, but getting us to where we were at the end of session, when the governor was able to sign the budget and our climate bills. As someone who worked in the federal government, I can tell you the advocacy, policy development, community-based organizations in California make us better at our jobs, make the budget better, make all of those bills better. And we wouldn't be here without the great partnership with you all and everyone tuning in today. Dave, I thought I would take a moment. You have a star-studded cast of agency leaders here, but only about half of the agencies that were involved in developing the budget are online today. There were a dozen agencies throughout the California government that sat down with us about this time last year and really thought about the question, how can we, California is a global leader on so many different parts of the climate crisis, but how can we, for our next act, show the rest of the world that tackling climate change can deliver economic opportunity, can build resilient, just, and equitable communities and a future for all Californians. And so really evolved out of the kind of traditional climate as an environmental issue and are now really looking at, throughout those 12 agencies and across the state's budget, how we integrate climate equity and economic opportunity throughout. The fiscal situation is a little bit, has changed since we were able to put this together. But I would say, the climate cabinet, those dozen agencies that came together, have all recognized have all gone through the process now of turning over the stones across within each budget and thinking about how we can drive on our climate goals and how we can drive on our equity in California for all goals throughout each of the programs. And I know we like to throw around the budget is an all of government effort, but I would go one step further and say it's an all of society effort, from innovative things like advanced payment to making sure that we're thinking through in Clean Cars for All or in equitable building decarbonization, how communities are really in the center of designing these programs, implementing these programs in partnership with agency, gives me a lot of hope for potentially future years when there's less revenue, but we're making sure that all of our dollars are driving on our climate and equity goals.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And I will interject here just briefly to remind folks that are watching the webinar, please submit questions through the chat. Members of the public, members of the press will be selecting questions at the end to present to all of the panelists.
Dave,
thank
would
you.
you like to go next, or would you like me to go?
Go ahead, Tom.
Well, first of all, I want to start by thanking all the people from the government who are here. I think that everybody who's watching this webinar can see exactly how terrific California government leaders are. And I think that, that first panel was incredibly impressive. And I know Lauren and David, and this is a very outstanding group of people who have thought deeply about this and have acted really wisely for a long time. And this budget is partly a reflection of that, but it's only part of what they've done. And I think this is a great advertisement for what's going on intellectually in the state of California and Sacramento. Let me break down for a second. I just want to make 4 quick points. One is, when we talk about, Dave's question was, how do we encourage investment across California in climate? Let me break that down a little, because we're talking about several different things. One is deployment of existing technologies, whether that's EV, solar, wind, efficiency, distributed energy. You can look through this budget and see a bunch of money, and EVs are the most obvious place, $10 billion, but you're seeing basically an attempt, and the federal IRA bill is similar in a lot of the money being about encouraging faster, broader deployment of existing technologies, basically to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions. The second thing that this bill does, and that I think has correctly been pointed out is not separate from deployment, but it's connected, is resilience. The idea that we're not avoiding the climate crisis. We're in the climate crisis. We've seen it in California in multiple ways, probably most obviously in this state in terms of the fires, but basically that we're going to be investing in resilience, and that is going to be a payoff that is going to show up in multiple ways. The estimate that we'll save $23 billion as a state as a result of reducing pollution. We're going to see huge payoffs. The budget tends to show everything as an expense, but it's not just an expense. There's also the positive outcomes that we don't necessarily put numbers on, but this is actually an investment in California in many ways. And when we look at resilience, it is connected to deployment, but it's also something where it's going to have its own, in my mind, massive payoff. And so, brilliant thing. And the last thing here is about innovation. Let's be, I mean, it's kind of funny, we don't talk about this much, but California is the center of innovation in the world. And if you look at the budget surplus, some significant part of that in the last 3 years has been a result of an explosion of capital gains taxes taken in by California. You know, it's been a bull market. There's been lots of new technologies. My point being not that that's partly what's funded this California climate budget. It's also something where there's a huge opportunity for California to continue to lead. And I think it's really important for us intellectually to understand that, as Lauren said, this is an all society approach. This is not going to get solved by investors, but it's going to get solved by people across our society. And so I think part of it is to recognize, and of course I'm a professional investor, so I care about the money going to these solutions. I care about California leading on these solutions. I care about how we are together as a state, but I also care about intellectual leadership here, both in the government and policy sector, but also in the private sector. I would want us to communicate. So that's my first point. There are three things: deployment, resilience, innovation. My second point is we have a plan, and we've alluded to it, but this plan that is involved with this budget involves a 91% reduction in oil consumption. That everyone around the world keeps talking, but you need a plan. We have a plan. And I say that says so much about the people on this call, but also about the other people in state government. A 60% reduction in air pollution, and also 4 million jobs. You know, a huge economic plan for growth here and for higher wages in terms of what we can do for working people across the state. I want to say it's a huge plan, and you put in the context of the federal program, we're basically talking about every part of society. Every company is now a climate company. Every part of society is going to contribute. My third point is this: I just want to reiterate what Shireen said, that climate policy doesn't work that doesn't start with environmental justice and addressing inequities. That's how you get the right outcomes. That's how it works. I think that Gustavo was talking about housing. This really is all interconnected. It's impossible to separate housing from electricity. It's impossible to separate electricity from transportation or manufacturing. This is a very interconnected problem. And the last thing I want to say is this: this is a budget. It's obviously, we have a ton of extra money in our state as a result of a confluence of events. That won't always be true. We know that, and you can read about it in the paper. But what has also been true about California over the last 50 years is the state has led intellectually in terms of rules. And just because we don't have huge budget surpluses doesn't mean that we've run out of ideas. And in fact, California has led, starting, with building codes, but right through clean air and clean water. We have led in a willingness to write rules. And that is something that will drive investment. I can tell you, I've looked at 1 million different companies, and the rulemaking that basically puts polluting companies on a level playing field with clean companies is something that drives investment in the best possible way. So those are a few points that I wanted to make, but I really did start by saying how impressed I am by the people in our government and the job that they've done, and the job that they're showing today is really, I think, incredibly outstanding.
Yeah, well said, Tom. I can build on that. I think we're entering a period I would call the great implementation. We are done with the debate about whether to go big on clean energy solutions, and it's really about getting all this stuff deployed. And I think that can and already is bearing a lot of fruit on the transportation electrification side. Just on that alone, we're spending $10 billion. And we have this, historic executive order the governor signed to get to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035. We now have 43 manufacturing operations in California making electric vehicles. We're making about 1,500 electric vehicles a day in our state, including buses, Proterra and BYD, and Zero motorcycles and Tesla and many more. as well as batteries, as well as charging infrastructure. And that's a great example of, we're changing the world on this. And I think, many of the things we're doing, we are actually the #1 place in the world, as Tom said, for this. And we're a postcard from the future. And I think, it's important to recognize what is happening in DC is historic. I mean, this IRA passage, we're the single biggest beneficiary of that as a state. We have 10-year tax credits for solar, for wind, for geothermal, for electric vehicles, for energy storage, for electric heat pumps. We're the largest market for most of those technologies. And so that is just supercharging our efforts. The majority of US clean tech venture capital today flows into California because of our climate policies. And that's a good sign. That's I think, the seed planting for the industries of the future. And I do think we forget sometimes just how historic a role we've played. Our state is a giant incubator, and we were the birthplace globally for the wind industry. First utility scale wind project in the world was Altamont Pass. We were the birthplace for the solar industry. The first utility scale solar projects in the world were here in Sacramento, and largest rooftop program in Sacramento in the 80s. And those have gone on to become the 2 fastest growing, lowest cost energy industries in the world. Electric vehicles as well with Tesla. And then the whole field of energy storage, and even the field of energy efficiency codes and standards. So what's exciting is to see this stuff take hold. And just taking the 100% clean energy mandate as an example, which the governor just accelerated last month, which is now going to get us to 90% clean electricity by 2035, and then 95 by 2040, and 100% by 2045. That's now law in 21 states, and President Biden has set it as the goal for the nation. And so that doesn't happen without California. And a lot of our climate strategy is now what I call the electrification of almost everything, as we're cleaning up transportation, and you're seeing the whole auto industry move towards electric. So we're a giant lever. I think we should be proud of that. I think it's part of our identity. And this next chapter is going to be incredibly exciting. I just want to highlight one thing we haven't talked about yet, which is offshore wind, which is another huge win we had this summer. We set the state goal for offshore wind, 25 gigawatts. That leverages over $100 billion of new investment into the state. And the first lease sale is going to happen by the end of this year for offshore wind off the west coast of the United States. And that's going to help supply electricity for all the electric vehicles that are coming on the road. Almost 1,000 electric vehicles a day we're adding. So really exciting time. And I do think, our economy is one of the fastest growing in the world because of this. So they all fit together.
And David, maybe we, or Dave, can we just engage in conversation now? Or would you like, okay. David, I guess I would offer an incredible track record in the energy sector, thanks to your leadership and so many others before you, increasingly in the electric vehicle sector. And what this budget tries to do is make sure that California will lead on heat pumps and direct air capture and climate smart ag techniques, and like across the board, every faction of society, making sure that it is, as Tom said, innovated in California, built in California. We have the careers here, the intellectual capacity here. A lot of what the governor kind of sat down and challenged us with was, if you look at what California has done on aerospace and information technology and biotechnology, we have this capacity really to transform the world as it relates to new technology, new ideas, new innovation. And so throughout the budget, we tried to invest in climate opportunities at our UC, CSU, and community colleges, different innovation hubs. Over at LWDA, we have funding for oil well capping and goods movement. I mean, the entire career pathway, making sure that we are delivering those opportunities for Californians across the economy was really kind of the big picture idea that we hope to deliver now in the next few years. And a lot of what you were building on, Tom, we have this history of innovation. We have this history of intellectual capacity. We need to make sure that it is deployed on climate across the board.
So I want to echo what Lauren just said. California does have a history of innovating across the board. I mean, it is in IT, it was in defense. I mean, California has been traditionally, at the bleeding edge of change in the United States for as long as any of us have been around. the key thing to me in this, I really want that to continue. Obviously, I think that's a huge strength for this state. I want to make sure that as much as possible, we also we actually build the things here. You know, from the standpoint of this state, it's going to be really important. I mean, we did innovate in solar and wind, but an awful lot of that manufacturing took place in China. You know, Tesla did start here and they've moved their headquarters to Texas. I think it's going to be really important for us as a state to be mindful about our need to keep as many, just from a job standpoint. You know, it's really good for working people. And part of that's going to be about training. As Lauren was saying, there's a huge shortage of skilled workers, not just in California, but across the United States in terms of these new industries. And to the extent we can help people in terms of training, be ready for those jobs, that's something which is a state that would be, and I love our community colleges. I mean, everything that Lauren's saying, I am, you know, a fanatic about what a good job they do and what a good job they can do and how important they are. I also am a fanatic in terms of, I think this state can be a center of capitalism. And I mean, it's like people in this world tend to think that capitalism is located in New York and London and maybe Tokyo or, you know, Shanghai. I don't see why that shouldn't be in California, because in fact, this is the generation of new ideas and new, you know, whole new industries. That's what we do, whole new industries. We should be trying to push on that at every level in terms of how we invest our capital through the big state pension funds, but in everything. And the last thing I'll say is this: there is a lot of money out there in terms of loans from the federal government. One of the things that people don't talk about in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act is the over $350 billion that is going to come through the loan program to support new technologies. And I just want to make sure that that as Californians, we're aware of, broadly speaking, this is a huge chance for us in multiple ways. And I really want to make sure that I reiterate what I said about Shireen and Gustavo, that it is about, that this is going to, has to be about justice. That's the whole climate fight is infused with a need for justice up front and interconnectedness throughout society.
Well, Tom, maybe I'll let David jump in on manufacturing and making sure that it's here in state and everything he's been leading on Lithium Valley. But briefly, I will note, you know, when we sat down with our education colleagues who traditionally, you know, I would say aren't in the climate space, the first thing they said to me was, Lauren, Californian students are suffering from climate despair and climate anxiety, and it's distracting them in the classroom. And so, you know, a lot of what you'll see in the climate budget are investments in K through 12 in electric school buses, farm to school, making sure our schools are climate resilient. I do think there is an entire generation now that's really inspired to work on climate change because they're so concerned about their futures. And what the budget tries to do through that funding at community colleges and career pathways is really empower them to join the movement and lead the movement alongside us, knowing that the leaders tomorrow, the ideas of tomorrow that are going to help us tackle this crisis. But David, I'll turn it to you on manufacturing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom and Lauren, on that point. We have $250 million we're spending just on in-state ZEV manufacturing. So these are grants just to encourage battery manufacturing, charger manufacturing, and vehicle manufacturing in our state. And we're leveraging a lot of federal support as well. One of the things I'm really excited about, just the partnership with DOE and the new tax credits that we have. You know, if you do, for example, battery manufacturing in California, normally you get 30% tax credit for a battery now under the law. But if it's domestic content, you get another 10%, domestic manufacturing, another 10%. So we're talking about 50% tax credit for domestic manufacturing. We got to make sure that's here. We're the largest market for battery storage in the United States. And just take that one example. You know, we have increased by 15-fold the amount of battery storage on the grid from 200 megawatts in 2019 to 3,600 megawatts today, right? Incredible success story, a lot of jobs deploying that. We want to see those batteries made here as well. And so I think that's a huge opportunity, particularly with Lithium Valley and the chance to actually have lithium recovery in state through a very green process and actually be able to manufacture batteries entirely with materials from California, no cobalt and no nickel, which is the direction the industry is going. So some really great opportunities here. And I think, young people need hope. And I think when you can provide that pathway to a job to be part of the solution, it really gives people a sense of purpose and meaning. And that's the opportunity we have.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to bring all of the other panelists also back into the discussion here, as well as to go to some questions from members of the public and the press who are watching. Maybe I will kick us off. There's a question in the chat from Nadia Lopez from CalMatters. I will feel free to respond to that as written, or maybe I will add on to it a little bit. California's poorest residents do not own cars. The highest population for dependency on public transportation overlaps with the folks who are the most economically disadvantaged, least access to housing, the longest commutes, and often the schools that need the most work to come up to the standards that we all aspire to be climate resilient and run on clean energy. And so I think, as Director Velasquez alluded to, all of these things do really come together all at once in the life of a Californian, especially the Californians who are the hardest hit by climate impacts and economic issues. How do we, as we accelerate, well, I think a lot of folks talked about the ZEV transition, as we accelerate to zero emission transportation, how do we ensure that those folks are provided with access to equitable transportation opportunities that may or may not include private ZEV ownership, and also with the opportunity to get where they need to go without necessarily needing a car to get there in the first place?
You want to take a stab, or you want me to?
I'll get started, Lauren, and then I'm sure, and then please chime in. But I would say fully agree with that question. I think this is an area, frankly, where we need to do a little bit better. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars in the budget for zero emission transit, for making communities more walkable and bikeable, for the types of housing investments, densifying housing that Gustavo touched on. And you see both in our budget and in the IRA, more of a focus on zero emission vehicles, continuing with the passenger vehicle model. And that's something that we need to shift, and we are going to be making that shift. If you look at the scoping plan that the Air Resources Board is finalizing later this year, you're going to see a major focus on vehicle miles traveled, reducing vehicles miles traveled, which will help ensure also that we're advancing that equity agenda and making sure that we can't drive our way out of this problem, right? Like the ZEV focus is incredible. It's very important. It's not enough. And so we really are going to be expanding our focus, doing more on the transit side too.
Awesome. Thanks, Shane.
I just want to point out that we haven't touched much about the area of accountability. We're very focused in terms of housing accountability towards local jurisdictions. And I say that because there's been, over many decades, just a lot of bad decisions about where housing is approved in local jurisdictions that causes, sprawl that affects people, especially at the low and moderate income level, has further concentrated poverty. That's the housing that we have to build the most, the low and moderate income housing, based on the number that I gave earlier, 2.5 million new homes in the next 8 years. So we're very focused on where that housing goes going forward, especially the subsidized housing. We have to invest a lot more, of course, in order to build that housing, but that is location and the type of housing we build in terms of building standards. That's the way that we are going to also affect positively climate change. So accountability is very important. It starts with us, obviously, at the state level, but we have to remember that housing is still approved at the local level, and we have to exert some authority in order for localities to put housing in the right places and build it the right way.
So I guess within this context, Lauren, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to maybe say a word or two about the special session coming up. The price of gasoline is a big part of this conversation.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Dave. And the governor's been quite clear on the need for a special session. What we've seen in gas prices over the last few weeks, and the unexplained increases with prices at the pump, which we know, I mean, to everyone's focus on equity and justice, we know that that hits our families hardest in terms of paying too much at the pump to fill up their gas cars. So the governor has partnered with the legislature on a special session to look at a windfall profits tax to make sure that big oil is not price gouging Californians and that their profits, in fact, go back to the Californian families that are suffering too much from high prices. And, Dave, I think this just really focuses us all on what brought us to this webinar to begin with, which is we know we need to get off fossil fuels. We know that getting into an electric car for a low-income family or being able to have accessible, affordable transit nearby means that they won't have to go to the gas station, but moving our entire economy off of fossil fuels is our collective task, and doing so in an equitable way that delivers economic opportunity for Californians is the vision we're all working on.
Chair Hochschild, anything to add there? I know that you've been closely involved in these discussions as well.
Yeah, look, it's unacceptable. And, I wrote a letter to all the major oil refineries, asking for an explanation. We're going to be doing a hearing next month on this question. The radical departure from California gasoline price and the national gasoline price was, quite sudden and, inexplicable because it's not like there was some new policy that the state implemented that could be attributed to that. It's just this was a huge bump in prices. And so we know, as Lauren said, that it's a much higher portion of income that has to be spent on gas for low-income families. And so it's something we're totally committed to doing everything we can to address and prevent. And this is part of what needs to be managed in the transition, because we're mindful of, this is a very difficult transition. It's a necessary transition, but there are definitely challenges like this that have to be really, really carefully managed and having the guardrails to protect the public as we go forward.
There are a few questions in the chat about the importance of high quality jobs, family sustaining jobs. I think looking at the broader context of that, there's also the availability of affordable housing and affordable transportation. I think these all kind of come together. And actually to a point that Tom, you raised about the availability of loan funds in addition to these direct incentive dollars. Looking at these transition points, even where, for example, transitioning to zero emission school buses is a clear cost saver for schools. The upfront cost for a family or for a small business or for a school of participating in this transition is sometimes so much of a barrier that they can't gain the advantage of that long-term cost savings. Do you see a role either for private sector or the government loan programs or other regulations in helping to overcome that type of barrier, besides just the focus on creating good wage, good benefit jobs?
Are you asking me that question, David?
I am. If
Right.
It was a long.
I think
question.
a
I don't know
lot
if
of
that makes sense.
so let's talk for 1 second about what this whole transition is from fossil fuels to clean energy, whether it's in electricity, transportation, or buildings. I mean, it is conceptually about making an investment up front that pays off over time. So that, the great thing about wind and solar, the wind is free, the sun is free. The great thing about electric vehicles, you don't have to go pay $8 for a gallon of gas ever. So that you're making an investment up front and then you're saving thousands of dollars every single year. But if you're a poor family, you may not have the ability to make, or you don't have the ability to make that upfront investment, regardless of what the return is. So in fact, that is exactly the kind of thing where government or the private sector should be able to step in and make that possible. And that is something that California has been doing. I mean, I'm sure some of the people listening know that Kat Taylor and I started a community bank basically to provide those kinds of options, particularly to help low-income families do things like buy electric vehicles. That in fact, and that's working off a program from the state of California that enables us to do that. We could never do that on our own. But when we think about this, and I was trying to make this point a little bit about resilience, and this is the last thing I'll say. This is about, everybody talks about this in terms of expense, a $54 billion budget, but it's not just an expense. What we're not doing is seeing how much money we're saving, how many lives we can help, and we're not giving ourselves the credit for us changing as a society how we do things to help everybody, but making sure, as I said, that a bunch of the people, and I'm sure every single person on this panel feels in their guts, is it starts from the bottom up. And that those returns, those savings, those increased lives and livelihoods start from the bottom up, so that if this is going to succeed, that's how we should be judging ourselves.
So Tom, speaking of the the life-saving nature of a lot of the new laws and regulations that came about this year, and not just the investment, I actually want to spend a minute or two, Secretary Crowfoot, if you wouldn't mind discussing both the rules that your agency is promulgating around health and safety buffer zones around oil and gas wells, as well as the law SB 1137 that passed establishing minimum health and safety buffer zones, and the efforts by some members of the oil industry to overturn that law, whether that interacts with the rule, and anything else you'd like to say about that effort.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Well, the big picture is obviously, as Tom and Lauren and others mentioned, that we are accelerating our transition beyond fossil fuels and reducing our reliance and addiction on fossil fuels. And so, part of the policy broadly is how do we phase down and out our extraction of fossil fuels in the state as we phase out our dependence. And so we're excited and looking forward to more conversations on that in coming years. But at the same time, we have to protect California from the impacts of extraction that's already here. And I want to lift up the advocacy of community-based organizations, leaders of impacted communities that have essentially said to state leaders, it is unacceptable that drilling takes place adjacent to daycares and housing and libraries and schools. And there needs to be safety buffers from these sensitive places to extraction of, where oil is drilled. And so thanks to remarkable leadership in the legislature, Lena Gonzalez, Monique Limon, so many others, and that advocacy, and of course, Governor and Lauren, we now have a law that will create this buffer that's based on science. We convened a national panel of experts to really help understand what that buffer should be. And that's now enshrined in law. Terribly disappointing to see the fossil fuel industry make moves to put a referendum on the ballot that would strike that law. Essentially, their argument is, I suppose, that extraction should be next to those daycares and schools and sensitive areas. So from our perspective, leaders have spoken on behalf of Californians, and which is, as we phase down and out fossil fuels, we need to protect California communities. And we are going to be very focused on defeating that cynical attempt to undo this law, if indeed it makes the ballot.
Great, thank you. And last word to Lauren or Shireen, to coin toss if you like. How is, in concrete terms, how is California working with its neighbors in other states across the country, besides just the further adoption of the ZEV rules? What are we doing as a regional set of jurisdictions to make all of these efforts go further?
Thanks so much, Dave. I'll start and then pass it to you, Shireen. I would say California is 1% of global emissions. When we look at, and a leader in so much of what we've been discussing today, but we cannot do it alone. If we were carbon neutral tomorrow, we would still be seeing the climate impacts we've seen. So a lot of what we're trying to do is model for other jurisdictions and then export what is working. while also learning from other states and regions around the world in terms of best practices, because there are a number of other states and regions that are ahead of us on a number of issues. Last 2 weeks ago, the governor was able to join the Pacific Coast Collaborative leaders together with Washington, Oregon, and BC, and kind of double down on our commitment to work together on regional issues, whether it's an electricity grid or drought and wildfire, or how we're all thinking about embedding equity into our investments. Separately, the governor co-chairs the US Climate Alliance, 24 states who are all committed to working on this issue, no matter the changes in Washington that we'll see this fall or in 2 years. An incredibly important alliance during the Trump administration, but will continue to be an important alliance going forward. And then even broader than that, we co-chair the Under 2 Coalition, over 270 governments from all over the world working together on these issues. And just the solidarity that I think our entire team feels in learning from other jurisdictions and sharing what is working does give me that hope that David was talking about, that we all need in order to feel like we can actually curb down emissions and keep the climate safe and habitable. But Shireen, what would you add?
Thanks, Lauren. That was great. I would just add that, you know, in addition to all of the coalitions that Lauren just mentioned, we also have these MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with so many other countries and subnational jurisdictions. So, and they come to us, you know, whether it's Japan or New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and they want to work with us because we have so much to offer, that we have so many examples that other countries, other subnational jurisdictions can model their approach on.
And that will be the last word. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you to all of our panelists. Very grateful to have you here and for all of your ongoing work. We at NextGen will send out an email wrap up to everyone who attended this discussion with the link to the full video, and we'll be posting clips of it to our Twitter handle at NextGen_policy. Please visit our NextGen homepage, which is in the chat, as well as the Climate 100 homepage, where you can find our reports describing the budget, advocating for increased ambition and expansion beyond what we have already accomplished as we go forward. Please visit us on these sites and on social media. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to our team. We will be happy to try to address them as best we can. Once again, thanks everyone for attending, and please have a great day.